They say success is the best revenge, but patience is what makes it sweet. For 5 years, I watched my wife Victoria mock my mediocre career while she climbed her corporate ladder. What she never realized was that I wasn't just another office drone. I owned the entire building she worked in, and soon her fate would be in my hands. The night everything changed began like any other dinner party at our modernist home in the suburbs of Seattle. Rain tapped against the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a soothing backdrop to what would become an utterly humiliating evening. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria had insisted on hosting her work colleagues, again. These monthly gatherings had become a ritual of subtle torture for me, but tonight would be different. Not because I planned to reveal anything, but because tonight would be the final push I needed. I stood in our kitchen, carefully arranging the charcuterie board Victoria had instructed me to prepare. 5 different cheeses, imported prosciutto, and handmade crackers artfully displayed on the walnut serving tray I'd given her last Christmas. From the living room, I could hear my wife's melodic laughter, mixing with the distinct sounds of expensive glassware clinking together. "Michael, darling," Victoria called out, "bring out the appetizers, will you? We're absolutely famished." The way she said darling had changed over the years. What once held genuine affection now carried the unmistakable weight of condescension, a verbal pat on the head for a spouse she increasingly viewed as a disappointment. I picked up the heavy tray and made my way to the living room, where Victoria sat perched on the edge of our Italian leather sofa, surrounded by her admirers. Her marketing director, James, lounged beside her, while Kayla from HR and Victoria's assistant, Rebecca, occupied the adjacent armchairs. Their spouses, largely ornamental additions to the evening, stood awkwardly by the fireplace, clutching, their drinks like lifelines. "Here he is," Victoria announced as I set down the tray, "the man behind the woman." More laughter, sharp and pointed. I smiled politely and stepped back, assuming my usual position slightly outside their circle. Victoria was in her element, resplendent in her tailored burgundy dress that probably cost more than what she thought I made in a month. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, emphasizing her high cheekbones and the diamond earrings I'd anonymously sent to her office last week, a gift from an admirer that she'd proudly paraded in front of me. "Michael," James said, fixing me with the kind of smile reserved for children and pets, "Victoria tells me you're still at Westlake Analytics. How long has it been now?" 4 years. 5, I corrected quietly. 5 years, James exclaimed, exchanging a meaningful glance with Victoria. "In the same position?" I nodded, taking a sip of my sparkling water. I'd learned long ago that alcohol loosened tongues, including mine. Tonight I needed perfect clarity. "That's commitment," Rebecca added, clearly struggling to find something positive to say. Victoria laughed, the sound cutting through the room like a blade. "That's one word for it. I call it settling." She reached for her wine glass, her third of the evening. "Michael had such potential when we met. He was going to revolutionize the tech industry, weren't you, darling?" I met her gaze steadily. "We all have different paths. And some paths lead straight to mediocrity," Victoria quipped, earning another round of laughter. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria believed she'd married a man with ambition who had somehow lost his way, settling for a mid-level data analyst position while she ascended to chief marketing officer at Greenpoint Innovations. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Westlake Analytics was merely a shell company, one of many I'd established to disguise my actual operations. In reality, I was Alexander Chen, founder and CEO of Nexus Holdings, a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring undervalued commercial properties and transforming them into profitable investments. 5 years ago, we'd quietly purchased the very building that housed Greenpoint Innovations. 3 years ago, we'd become majority shareholders in Greenpoint itself, a fact concealed beneath layers of corporate entities and holding companies. James leaned forward, helping himself to a piece of aged Gouda. You know, Michael, Greenpoint is always looking for experienced data people. I'm sure Victoria could put in a good word for you. He winked conspiratorially. Help you move up in the world a bit? That's very kind, I said, but I'm comfortable where I am. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. See what I'm dealing with? No ambition whatsoever. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. See what I'm dealing with? No ambition whatsoever. Kayla, the HR director who I knew had been responsible for denying promotions to 3 qualified women over the past year based on internal reports I'd reviewed, patted Victoria's knee sympathetically. It must be so difficult for you, carrying the financial burden all these years. My wife sighed, playing the role of the long-suffering breadwinner to perfection. Someone has to pay for this lifestyle, the mortgage alone on this place. She trailed off, shaking her head. I bit back the urge to inform her that there was no mortgage. I'd purchased this house outright under another LLC and arranged for fake mortgage statements to maintain my cover. Every month, Victoria's mortgage payment went directly into an investment account in her name, one of the few genuine acts of care I still performed for the woman I once loved. At least he helps around the house, Rebecca offered, clearly trying to salvage some dignity for me. Victoria's laugh turned brittle. Oh, he's excellent at domestic duties, makes a divine risotto. Perhaps that should have been his career path. More laughter, more sidelong glances. I'd endured countless variations of this conversation over the years, but tonight felt different. There was a cruelty in Victoria's words that surpassed her usual gentle mockery. Perhaps it was the audience, or perhaps the distance between us had finally grown too wide to bridge. As the evening progressed, Victoria's comments grew increasingly cutting. Each barb was meticulously crafted to elevate her while diminishing me. I played my role perfectly, the docile husband with unfulfilled potential, occasionally offering a self-deprecating comment to diffuse the tension. Remember when Michael thought he was going to get that promotion last year? Victoria asked, addressing the room at large. He spent weeks preparing his presentation, bought a new suit and everything. I remembered it well. It wasn't a promotion I was seeking, but rather conducting a performance review of the Westlake Analytics team, most of whom had no idea they were actually working for me. He came home that night, looking like someone had run over his puppy, Victoria continued, her words slightly slurred from the wine. Apparently, they gave the position to some 20-something, with half his experience but twice his drive. Rebecca gasped sympathetically. That's awful. Was it at least a close decision? Victoria snorted. They told him he wasn't leadership material. Can you imagine? The room erupted in laughter, and I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger. I'd moved beyond that years ago. It was clarity, the final confirmation that the woman I'd married was gone, replaced by someone who derived pleasure from my perceived failures. Michael, be a dear and open another bottle of the Cabernet, Victoria instructed, waving her empty glass in my direction. I nodded and retreated to the kitchen, grateful for the momentary escape. As I uncorked the bottle, a $300 vintage I'd sourced from a vineyard my company had recently acquired, I glanced at my watch. In precisely 16 hours, the board meeting I'd arranged would take place. The restructuring plans for Greenpoint Innovations would be approved, and the first phase of my exit strategy would commence. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Victoria leaning close to James, speaking in hushed tones. I didn't need to hear the words to recognize the conspiratorial intimacy between them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Another piece of intelligence confirmed, one I'd suspected for months based on the hotel receipts and unusual meeting patterns my security team had flagged. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I heard Victoria say as I approached with the fresh bottle. "Living with someone who's satisfied with mediocrity is exhausting." James patted her hand, lingering a moment too long. "You deserve better, Vic. Everyone here knows it." I poured the wine silently, my face a careful mask of oblivion. Little did they know, tomorrow would mark the beginning of a seismic shift in all our lives. Greenpoint's restructuring would eliminate the entire marketing department, including Victoria's carefully cultivated position. James would discover that his recent indiscretions with company funds, the business dinners that were actually romantic rendezvous with my wife, had been meticulously documented, and Kayla from HR would face an independent investigation into her discriminatory practices. As I resumed my place on the periphery of the gathering, I caught Victoria's eye. For a brief moment, something like guilt flickered across her features, before being replaced by her practiced smile. "Everything all right, darling?" she asked, her tone suggesting she couldn't care less about the answer. I smiled back, a genuine expression for the first time that evening. "Everything's perfect," I replied, "just perfect." And in that moment, looking at the woman who'd spent years mocking my apparent lack of success while unwittingly living off its fruits, I felt an odd sense of peace. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed facade would begin to crumble, and Victoria would finally discover exactly who she'd been married to all these years. She raised her glass in a mock toast. "To my darling husband, proof that not everyone needs to reach for the stars." I raised my water glass in return. "To tomorrow," I said quietly, "and new beginnings." If only she knew just how new those beginnings would be. The dinner party dragged on for another 2 hours, each minute stretching like taffy as Victoria and her colleagues continued their performance. I moved through the evening like a ghost, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and nodding at appropriate intervals. The perfect, invisible husband. After James finished his elaborate story about securing the Anderson account, a deal I knew had actually been orchestrated by a junior associate whom he'd denied credit, Victoria clapped her hands together. "We should show everyone the renovation plans for the backyard," she exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement. "Michael, go get the sketches from my office." "Yes. Why don't you show us what you're doing with this gorgeous property?" Rebecca said. Glancing around appreciatively at our home, I nodded and headed upstairs to Victoria's home office. The room was immaculate, as always. Her desk perfectly organized, everything in its place, unlike my cluttered workspace, which she frequently complained about. The contrast between our spaces was yet another metaphor for how she viewed our relationship. Her life structured and ascending, mine chaotic and stagnant. The landscape designs were exactly where I expected them to be, in a portfolio marked Home Improvements. Victoria was nothing if not methodical. What she didn't know was that I had already approved these plans months ago, working directly with the landscape architect through an intermediary. The $175,000 project would break ground next month, though Victoria wouldn't be here to see its completion. As I reached for the portfolio, my eyes caught on a document partially hidden beneath a stack of magazines. I wouldn't have noticed it except for the Greenpoint letterhead and the bold confidential stamp across the top. Curious, I slid it out and scanned the contents. It was a draft of a company-wide restructuring plan, ironically similar to the one I had initiated, but vastly different in its details. Victoria's version preserved and expanded the marketing department while gutting research and development, the actual heart of Greenpoint's innovation. In the margins were her handwritten notes: James to SVP, Rebecca promotion, and most tellingly, Michael potential junior position. So this was their plan. Victoria intended to bring me into Greenpoint in some subordinate role, probably as a way to monitor me while maintaining her superiority. The presumption was breathtaking. She had no idea that by this time tomorrow, both she and James would be clearing out their offices. I carefully replaced the document exactly as I'd found it and took the landscape portfolio downstairs. "Here you are," I said, handing it to Victoria with a smile. She snatched it without thanks and began eagerly displaying the designs to her friends, describing the outdoor kitchen, the infinity pool, and the Japanese garden elements as if they were already built. "It's going to cost a fortune," she said with a conspiratorial whisper that was intentionally loud enough for me to hear. "But I got my year-end bonus early. Michael doesn't even know yet." Kayla leaned forward. "How much are we talking?" "Just under 200,000, Victoria replied casually, as if discussing the price of a dinner. I suppressed a smile. The bonus Victoria was so proud of, $50,000 before taxes, wouldn't cover even a third of the project. The remainder would come from my accounts, as always, channeled through our joint finances, in a way that let Victoria believe her income was sustaining our lifestyle. "Worth every penny," James said, his eyes not on the designs, but on Victoria. I caught Rebecca noticing the same thing, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face before she masked it with enthusiasm for the stone pathways depicted in the sketches. The night wore on. The conversation inevitably circled back to work, specifically to my perceived career failures. "So, Michael," Kayla began, her HR training making her tone particularly condescending, "have you thought about pursuing additional certifications, something to help you advance beyond your current position?" Before I could respond, Victoria jumped in. "I've been telling him that for years. I even offered to pay for a management course last Christmas, but he said he was comfortable where he is." She made air quotes around comfortable, transforming the word into something shameful. What Victoria didn't know was that I held 2 graduate degrees, one in business from Stanford and another in computer science from MIT, both completed before we met and both under my legal name, Alexander Chen. Michael Warren, the identity I'd adopted for my undercover role, had a deliberately unremarkable resume. "I appreciate the concern," I said mildly, "but I find my work fulfilling in its own way." James snorted into his wineglass. "Fulfilling. Right." He turned to the other guests. "You know what Michael does all day? He stares at spreadsheets, checks numbers, the most basic data entry and verification." "That's not entirely accurate," I began, only to be cut off by Victoria. "Darling, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Not everyone is built for leadership." Her tone suggested she was defending me, but her words were carefully calculated to diminish. "James, don't be cruel. Michael is very thorough with his spreadsheets." The room filled with chuckles, and I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the kind of tranquility that comes from absolute certainty. In that moment, watching Victoria perform her concern while twisting the knife, I knew I was making the right decision. "I should probably start cleaning up," I said, rising from my seat and gathering empty glasses. "Yes, that's a good idea," Victoria agreed, not bothering to offer help or ask her guests to assist. "We'll have coffee in the living room." As I loaded the dishwasher in the kitchen, I could hear them continuing their conversation, their voices carrying clearly through our open concept. "Home. I don't know how you do it, Victoria," Kayla was saying, "managing your career and, well, managing him too." Victoria's laugh was light and practiced. "Some days are harder than others, but what choice do I have? Someone has to be ambitious. In this marriage, I methodically rinsed plates and arranged them in the dishwasher, my movements automatic as my mind drifted to tomorrow's board meeting. The presentation was already prepared, the votes secured. After 5 years of careful maneuvering, all the pieces were finally in place. My phone vibrated in my pocket with a text from Lynn, my chief operations officer, and one of the few people who knew about my double life. Everything set for tomorrow. Board members briefed individually. Legal team standing by. Sure you want to go through with this? I typed a quick response. Absolutely, no changes. Another text came immediately. What about Victoria? Still proceeding as discussed. I glanced into the living room, where my wife was now showing off the designer watch I'd given her for her birthday, another gift she believed she'd purchased with her own money. Yes, I replied, exactly as planned. When I returned to the living room with coffee, the conversation had shifted to the upcoming charity gala that Greenpoint sponsored annually. Victoria was in the middle of describing her new gown, a $12,000 designer piece she believed had been heavily discounted due to her connections. Michael won't be attending this year, she mentioned casually. He's not really comfortable in those environments. Isn't that right, darling? All eyes turned to me expectantly. Actually, I said, setting down the coffee tray, I was planning to attend this year. Victoria's smile faltered momentarily before she recovered. Oh, that's unexpected. Are you sure? These events are very high profile. The CEO of Nexus Holdings will be there, and several other major players in the industry. The irony of her statement nearly made me laugh out loud. Yes, the CEO of Nexus Holdings would indeed be there, just not in the way she imagined. I think they can manage, I said simply. Victoria exchanged a look with James that clearly communicated her embarrassment at the thought of introducing her underachieving husband to Seattle's business elite. Well, she said finally, we'll discuss it later, which meant in Victoria speak that she would spend the next week convincing me not to attend until I eventually chose to stay home. As the evening finally wound down and our guests prepared to leave, Victoria was in rare form, glowing with the satisfaction of an evening spent reinforcing her superiority. She hugged each guest at the door, making plans for lunches and spa days. James was the last to leave, lingering longer than necessary. Great evening, Vic, he said, kissing her cheek and letting his lips stay against her skin a beat too long. See you at the office tomorrow. Then, as an afterthought, good night, Michael, good luck with those spreadsheets. I smiled and nodded, already picturing the expression on his face when security escorted him from the building tomorrow afternoon. After closing the door behind him, Victoria turned to me, her smile fading. You could have made more of an effort. Tonight, James was trying to help you with that Greenpoint suggestion. I began gathering the remaining coffee cups. Was he? It seemed more like he was helping himself to my wife. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said calmly. I'm just tired. It's been a long night. Well, I'm going to bed, she announced, already heading for the stairs. Don't forget to finish the dishes and set the alarm. I watched her ascend the staircase, her posture perfect even after several glasses of wine. Once, I had admired that poise. Now I recognized it as part of her carefully constructed facade, just like mine, though built for entirely different reasons. Victoria, I called after her. She paused, turning with obvious impatience. Yes? Tomorrow's going to be an important day, I said. You might want to dress accordingly. She gave me a puzzled look. It's just another Tuesday. Board meeting in the morning, client lunch at noon. I nodded slowly. Yes, just another Tuesday. As she disappeared upstairs, I moved through our quiet house, turning off lights and locking doors. In the morning, Victoria would wake up as the CMO of Greenpoint Innovations, secure in her position and her marriage to a man she thought she could control. By nightfall, both illusions would be shattered beyond repair. I woke before my alarm, the grey Seattle dawn filtering through our bedroom windows. Victoria slept soundly beside me, her breathing deep and even. For a moment, looking at her peaceful face, I almost remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. Ambitious, yes, but also kind and supportive. The woman who had once believed in my dreams before she replaced them with her own. That woman was long gone, buried beneath layers of status-seeking and materialism. I slipped quietly from the bed and headed to the shower, mentally preparing for the day ahead. By the time Victoria's alarm chimed at 6:30 a.m., I was already dressed in the unremarkable grey suit I typically wore to my analyst job. Deliberately, ill-fitting and purchased off the rack at a department store. It was part of my Michael Warren uniform, designed to be forgettable. Victoria emerged from the bathroom wrapped in her silk robe, her hair already perfectly styled. She eyed my outfit with a familiar mixture of resignation and disdain. "Big day?" she asked, her tone suggesting she couldn't imagine what significance any day at my job might hold. "You could say that," I replied, adjusting my slightly crooked tie in the mirror. I deliberately left it askew, another small detail in my carefully constructed mediocrity. Victoria disappeared into her expansive walk-in closet, emerging minutes later in a tailored crimson dress that probably cost more than what she thought I made in 2 months. The irony wasn't lost on me that her entire wardrobe had been funded by the very success she mocked me for lacking. "I might be late tonight," she said, as she applied her makeup with practiced precision. "The board meeting is this morning, and then we're taking the potential investors from Nexus Holdings to dinner." I paused, pretending to struggle with my watch strap. "Nexus Holdings? Aren't they the real estate investment firm?" Victoria rolled her eyes. "They're much more than that. They're one of the largest private equity firms in the Pacific Northwest. They own half the commercial real estate in downtown Seattle." She sighed dramatically. "This is exactly why you're still checking data entries for a living, Michael. You don't keep up with the market." If only she knew that I'd been in meetings until midnight last night, finalizing Nexus Holdings' acquisition of 3 more properties in the South Lake Union. Tech Corridor, a $375 million deal that would be announced next week. "Well, good luck with your meeting," I said mildly. She snapped her makeup compact closed. "I don't need luck. James and I have been preparing this presentation for weeks. The board is finally going to approve our departmental expansion." She gave her reflection one final appraising look. "Maybe you should think about luck, or better yet, finally take that career counseling I've been suggesting." I smiled. "Maybe today will bring some unexpected changes." Victoria barely heard me, already scrolling through her emails on her phone as she headed downstairs. I followed, carrying her briefcase like the supportive husband I was supposed to be. In the kitchen, I handed her the travel mug of coffee I'd prepared, precise amounts of organic cream and cane sugar, exactly 157 degrees, just as she preferred. Another small service I provided that she had come to expect without acknowledgement. "Don't forget, we have the Hendersons' dinner party on Friday," she said, accepting the coffee without thanks. "Wear the blue suit I bought you, not this thing." She gestured vaguely at my current outfit. "Of course," I replied, though I knew neither of us would be attending that dinner party. By Friday, Victoria's social calendar would be the least of her concerns. She glanced at her watch, the Cartier I'd given her last year through an elaborate ruse involving a contest she'd supposedly won at a charity auction. "I need to go. The board meets at 8, and I want to review the presentation with James." "Beforehand," I nodded, playing my part one final time. "Have a good day, dear." Victoria paused at the door, her expression softening slightly. For a moment, I glimpsed something like guilt in her eyes. "You too, Michael. And maybe we can talk about that Greenpoint position this weekend. It might be good for you, for us." Then she was gone, the door closing firmly behind her. I stood in the kitchen, listening to her BMW, purchased with her money, back out of the driveway. When the sound of the engine faded, I walked calmly to my home office and locked the door. Inside, I opened the closet and pushed aside the hanging files and storage boxes to reveal a hidden panel. Behind it was a small safe containing everything I needed for today: my actual phone, my real ID and credentials, and the tailored Brioni suit I would wear to the board meeting. I sent a quick text to Lynn. Victoria just left. Phase 1 begins. Is everything in place? Her response came immediately. All set. Car will be at the usual spot in 30 minutes. Facial recognition has been temporarily disabled at Greenpoint Security. Legal team standing by. I changed quickly, transforming from Michael Warren, forgettable data analyst, into Alexander Chen, CEO of Nexus Holdings. The difference wasn't just in the quality of the suit or the genuine Patek Philippe watch that replaced my drugstore Timex. It was in my posture, my expression, the way I carried myself, all the aspects of my true identity I had suppressed for 5 long years. As I knotted my tie, perfectly this time, I thought about how this elaborate deception had begun. Victoria and I had met at a charity gala 7 years ago. I was already successful, Nexus Holdings well established, with assets exceeding 800 million. But my previous relationship had ended badly when I discovered my fiancé was more interested in my wealth than in me. When I met Victoria, brilliant, ambitious and seemingly genuine, I made a fateful decision. I would court her under a different identity to ensure her interest was authentic. Michael Warren was born, a modest data analyst with potential but limited success. I told Victoria I'd recently started my own consulting business, which explained my flexible schedule and comfortable, though not luxurious, lifestyle. I rented a small apartment for our early dates, though I actually owned the entire building. The plan was simple: reveal my true identity after 6 months, once I was certain of her character. But something unexpected happened. As Victoria's career at Greenpoint took off, I began to see a different side of her. Her ambition calcified into arrogance. Her encouragement became criticism. When she believed my business was struggling, rather than supporting me, she began to pull away, making it clear that my perceived failure diminished her attraction. Curious to see how far this would go, I maintained the charade. We married 2 years into our relationship, with Victoria clearly believing she was the primary breadwinner, despite the lucky investments and family inheritance that explained our increasingly comfortable lifestyle. Year by year, as her success grew, so did her contempt. The woman who had once admired my intelligence now spoke to me as if I were a child. The partner who had once valued my thoughts now dismissed them without consideration. And over the past year, she had begun her affair with James, apparently unwilling to limit herself to a husband she considered beneath her. Throughout it all, I watched and waited, methodically building my case and preparing for the moment when the truth would finally emerge. That moment had arrived. I checked my watch. 7:15 a.m. Victoria would be at Greenpoint now, finalizing her presentation with James, blissfully unaware that in less than an hour I would walk into the boardroom, not as a potential investor, but as their new owner. My secure phone rang, Lynn calling as planned. "The car is 5 minutes out," she said without preamble. "Are you ready for this? Once we start, there's no going back." I took one last look around the house Victoria believed she had paid for with her success, the artwork she boasted, about to her friends, the furniture she had selected to impress her colleagues, the crown molding she had insisted was essential to maintain the home's character. All of it provided by me, all of it used as props in her performance of superiority. "I've been ready for 2 years," I replied. "It's time Victoria learned who she's really been married to." "And after today?" Lynn asked, her tone careful. She had been one of the few to question my elaborate plan, concerned about both its professional and personal implications. After today, Nexus Holdings will complete its restructuring of Greenpoint as planned. The company has potential, but the current leadership has created a toxic culture that's stifling innovation. And Victoria? I paused, considering the question. Despite everything, despite the mockery and the affair and the years of condescension, a small part of me still remembered the woman Victoria had been when we met. Or perhaps the woman I had believed her to be. Victoria will finally understand the consequences of underestimating people, I said finally, especially her husband. As I ended the call, a text came through from an unknown number, my private investigator confirming that Victoria and James had indeed arrived at Greenpoint. Together, having apparently met for breakfast before heading to the office. The attached photo showed them embracing in the parking garage, a lingering kiss that removed any last doubts about the nature of their relationship. I felt a curious emptiness looking at the image. Not jealousy or anger, just confirmation of what I had already known. Another piece of evidence in a case that had been building for years. The doorbell rang. My driver, right on schedule. I gathered my briefcase containing the documents that would reshape Greenpoint Industries and, by extension, Victoria's carefully constructed world. It was time for Michael Warren to disappear and Alexander Chen to reclaim his life. The Greenpoint Innovations headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming glass tower in downtown Seattle. I'd purchased the building through a subsidiary 3 years ago, though the transaction had been carefully obscured through multiple shell companies. As far as Greenpoint's executives were concerned, they merely had a new landlord who had been surprisingly accommodating about their lease terms. My driver pulled up to the private entrance, reserved for VIPs and board members. The security guard, one of my employees, though he didn't know it, checked my ID and waved me through with a respectful nod. "Good morning, Mr. Chen. The board is gathering on the 32nd floor." I thanked him and headed to the private elevator, my footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. This was the first time I had entered the building as myself since acquiring it. Usually, I conducted my periodic inspections through the service entrances, dressed in maintenance coveralls, invisible to the executives who would have been shocked to learn their janitor was actually their landlord. Lynn was waiting for me in the executive lobby, her tablet in hand. In her impeccable charcoal suit and with her characteristic efficiency, she was the perfect counterpoint to my public persona, handling the day-to-day operations that allowed me to work behind the scenes. The board members are all here, except for Harrison, who's calling in from Tokyo, she informed me, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the boardroom. Victoria and James arrived 20 minutes ago and are already setting up their presentation. And the security protocols in place. Once the meeting begins, access to the floor will be restricted. The legal team is on standby in the adjacent conference room. HR has been briefed about the terminations, and IT is prepared to restrict system access immediately. I nodded, taking a deep breath as we approached the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. Through the small glass panel, I could see Victoria arranging presentation materials, James hovering close behind her. The other board members, 8 men and women representing Greenpoint's major investors, were settling into their seats, reviewing documents and making small talk. None of them knew what was about to happen. None of them knew that Nexus Holdings had been systematically acquiring Greenpoint stock through various fronts for the past 3 years, or that as of yesterday we had secured a controlling interest of 58%. "Ready?" Lynn asked quietly. I checked my watch, 7:55 a.m. "Yes, let's proceed." She pushed open the door, and we stepped into the boardroom. The conversation immediately hushed as all eyes turned to us. I saw confusion on most faces, uncertainty on others. Victoria looked up from her presentation materials, her expression shifting from professional engagement to puzzled assessment as she took in my appearance. She clearly didn't recognize me in my bespoke suit and perfectly groomed state, so different from the deliberately rumpled Michael she had left at home. Greg Parker, Greenpoint's CEO, rose to greet us. "Ah, you must be the representatives from Nexus Holdings. Welcome. We were just about to begin." Before I could respond, Victoria stepped forward, extending her hand with her most charming professional smile, the one I had seen her practice in the mirror countless times. "Victoria Warren, Chief Marketing Officer," she said smoothly. "We're very excited about the potential partnership between our companies." The moment stretched between us as I met her gaze directly. I saw no flicker of recognition in her eyes, just the practiced warmth she reserved for important clients. It was remarkable how completely she had compartmentalized her husband as someone insignificant, to the point where she couldn't even recognize me in a different context. I took her hand, noting the brief confusion that crossed her face at my prolonged silence. "Alexander Chen," I said finally, "CEO and founder of Nexus Holdings." I watched as she processed the information, mentally calculating the importance of this meeting to her career. Her smile widened as she squeezed my hand with just the right amount of pressure, firm but not aggressive, confident but not threatening, the perfect executive handshake she had practiced with coaching services. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Chen. I've followed your company's growth with great interest." Behind her, James stepped forward, clearly eager to insert himself into the conversation with what he perceived as the most important person in the room. "James Kelly, VP of Marketing. We've prepared an extensive presentation on our expansion plans that I think you'll find compelling." I nodded without releasing Victoria's hand, my eyes still locked with hers. "I'm looking forward to it, though I should mention that this meeting may not proceed exactly as you've anticipated." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Victoria's face as she gently extracted her hand from mine. For the first time, I saw her look at me more carefully, a faint crease appearing between her eyebrows. "Have we met before?" she asked, her voice lower now. Before I could answer, Greg Parker called the meeting to order, gesturing for everyone to take their seats. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then returned to her place beside James, though I noticed her eyes darting back to me periodically as everyone settled in. "Good morning, everyone," Parker began. "As you know, we've called this special board meeting to discuss the proposed marketing department expansion and the potential investment from Nexus Holdings." He nodded toward me. "We're pleased to welcome Alexander Chen, CEO of Nexus, who has expressed interest in a significant partnership with Greenpoint." Parker turned to me. "Mr. Chen, before we begin the formal presentations, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about your interest in our company." I stood, buttoning my jacket as I surveyed the room. Victoria was watching me intently now, that puzzled look still on her face. James seemed impatient, clearly eager to launch into his prepared pitch. "Thank you, Mr. Parker. I appreciate the opportunity to address the board directly." I paused, making eye contact with each person around the table. "Nexus Holdings has indeed been interested in Greenpoint innovations for some time. In fact, our interest has been more substantial than any of you realize." I nodded to Lynn, who distributed folders to each board member. "If you'll open these documents, you'll find verification that Nexus Holdings, through various subsidiaries, has acquired 58% of Greenpoint's outstanding shares over the past 3 years. The room erupted in confused murmurs as the board members flipped through the documents. Parker's face had gone pale, while Victoria and James exchanged alarmed glances. This can't be right," Parker stammered. "Our shareholder records don't show—" "Your records show multiple investment groups and holding companies," I interrupted smoothly. "Highland Capital Partners, Blue Ocean Ventures, Cascade Investment Group, all of these are Nexus subsidiaries operating under my direction." The realization of what this meant was dawning on their faces now. Victoria's perfect composure was cracking as she frantically scanned the documents, probably searching for some loophole or mistake. As the majority shareholder, I continued, Nexus Holdings is exercising its right to restructure Greenpoint's executive leadership, effective immediately. Parker half rose from his chair. You can't just walk in here and... I can, and I am, I said firmly. The legal documentation is in order, as your corporate counsel can confirm. I gestured to Patricia Winters, Greenpoint's legal director, who was ashen-faced as she reviewed the papers. He's right, she said quietly. These acquisitions appear legitimate. If Nexus holds 58%, they have controlling interest. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is outrageous. You can't just stage a hostile takeover without any warning. I turned to her, maintaining my professional demeanor. It's not a hostile takeover, Ms. Warren. It's a necessary restructuring to address the systemic issues that have been plaguing Greenpoint for years. Issues that the current leadership has either ignored or exacerbated. James was on his feet now, too, his face flushed with anger. What systemic issues? Greenpoint's profits have increased 22% under our direction. Surface profits achieved through unsustainable cost-cutting measures and quality reduction, I corrected him. Meanwhile, employee turnover has reached 47%. 3 key patents have been lost to competitors due to mismanagement, and the company culture has become toxic, particularly in the marketing department. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she studied my face more intently. Something was clicking into place for her, some recognition beginning to form. Who are you really? She demanded. What's your actual agenda here? The moment had arrived. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my second wallet, the beaten leather one containing Michael Warren's driver's license. I placed it on the table and slid it toward Victoria. Perhaps this will clarify things, I said quietly. She picked it up with trembling fingers, opening it to reveal the ID card with my photograph but Michael's name. For several seconds, she simply stared at it, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the two identities. When she finally looked up, her face had drained of all color. Michael, she whispered, disbelief evident in every syllable. The room had gone completely silent, everyone watching this unexpected drama unfold without understanding its significance. Hello, Victoria, I said calmly. Surprise. Michael? Victoria repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as they held my driver's license. This can't be real. The confusion in the boardroom was palpable. The other executives exchanged bewildered glances, trying to piece together what was happening. I don't understand, Greg Parker said, looking between Victoria and me. You two know each other? I maintained my composure, buttoning my suit jacket. As I addressed the room, allow me to clarify for everyone. My legal name is Alexander Chen. I am the founder and CEO of Nexus Holdings. However, for the past 5 years, Victoria has known me as Michael Warren, her husband. The stunned silence that followed was broken only by James's incredulous laugh. This is absurd. Victoria's husband is a data analyst at some small consulting firm. His voice trailed off as he looked at Victoria, whose ashen expression confirmed the truth. Ms. Lin, I said calmly, please distribute the second set of documents. Lin efficiently handed out another round of folders. These contained detailed reports on Greenpoint's operational deficiencies, documented instances of misconduct, and my proposed restructuring plan. Victoria hadn't moved, her eyes still fixed on me as if seeing a ghost. All this time, she whispered, the house, the cars, the vacations, all provided by me. I confirmed. Nexus Holdings currently manages assets exceeding 3.2 billion. The modest data analyst you've been mocking for years has been funding your entire lifestyle. James grabbed the folder in front of Victoria and flipped through it frantically. His face grew increasingly pale as he reached the section detailing his own misconduct, complete with dates, times, and photographic evidence of his affair with Victoria, alongside documentation of his misappropriation of company resources. "This is a personal vendetta," he sputtered, looking around the table for support. "He can't be objective about company matters when he's clearly acting out of jealousy." I smiled thinly. "My personal feelings are irrelevant, Mr. Kelly. The numbers speak for themselves. Your department has consistently overspent its budget while under-delivering on results. The Anderson account you claimed as your success was actually secured by Melissa Zhang, a junior associate whom you subsequently denied promotion despite her exemplary performance." I turned a page in my own copy of the report. "You've also been charging personal expenses to the company, specifically hotel rooms, at the Fairmont Olympic on 13 separate occasions over the past 8 months. Interestingly, those dates correspond precisely to Victoria's alleged late nights at the office." Several board members shifted uncomfortably, now understanding the personal dimension of this corporate takeover. Patricia Winters, the legal director, cleared her throat. "Mr. Chen, or Warren, whatever your name is, while these allegations are concerning, they seem rather personal in nature." "The personal and professional misconduct are intertwined, Ms. Winters," I replied. "But if you prefer to focus solely on business matters, you'll find that the restructuring plan on page 12 is based entirely on performance metrics and objective business goals." Victoria finally seemed to recover her voice. "This is revenge," she said, her tone hardening as the initial shock gave way to anger. "You've been lying to me for our entire marriage, pretending to be someone you're not, and now you're trying to destroy my career because I—" "What? Hurt your feelings?" I met her gaze steadily. "I created Michael Warren because my previous relationship ended when I discovered my partner was interested only in my wealth. I wanted to find someone who valued me for myself, not my bank account." I allowed a hint of sadness to color my voice. "When we met, you seemed to be that person. You were supportive, kind, ambitious in a way I admired." Victoria flinched slightly at the description of her former self. "But over time," I continued, "as you believed my career was stagnating, your supportive nature transformed into contempt. You began to mock me, first privately, then publicly. You flaunted your success as if it somehow diminished mine. You turned me into an object of ridicule among your friends." I gestured toward James. "And eventually you decided I wasn't even worth your fidelity." James stood abruptly. "This is insane. I'm not going to sit here and—" "You'll sit," I interrupted firmly, "or you'll be escorted out immediately. Your choice." He hesitated, then slowly sank back into his chair, his eyes darting toward the door, where 2 security officers now stood at attention. Victoria's shock had fully converted to rage now. So this elaborate deception, this whole charade, was what? A test? You were evaluating whether I was worthy of the great Alexander Chen? Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Did it ever occur to you that lying to your wife for 5 years might be the actual betrayal here? Several board members nodded slightly, clearly finding some merit in her argument despite their own precarious positions. You're right, I acknowledged, surprising her. The deception was wrong. I should have revealed the truth years ago. But after a certain point, I became curious about how far your disdain would go. Would there be a limit to how much you could belittle someone you had promised to love and respect? Apparently not. I turned to address the entire table. However, this meeting isn't about my marriage. It's about the future of Greenpoint Innovations. The company has tremendous potential that's being squandered by poor leadership and a toxic culture that starts at the top. I nodded to Lynn, who tapped on her tablet. The large screen at the end of the boardroom came to life, displaying a comprehensive organizational chart. Effective immediately, Greg Parker is removed as CEO. The board will appoint an interim chief executive from the list of qualified candidates provided in your folders. James Kelly and Victoria Warren are terminated for cause, with the documented ethical violations sufficient to void their golden parachute provisions. Parker slumped in his chair, while James began to protest loudly until one of the security officers stepped forward, silencing him with a stern look. Victoria stood perfectly still, her face a mask of controlled fury. "You won't get away with this," she said quietly. "I'll fight you in court. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of manipulative, deceitful person you really are." I smiled sadly. "You're welcome to try, Victoria. But before you do, I suggest you review your prenuptial agreement, particularly the infidelity clause on page 7. You'll find that in the event of proven unfaithfulness, you forfeit all claims to my assets and businesses." Her face paled again as the full implications sank in. Not only was she losing her job, but she was about to discover that the house she thought she owned, the cars she believed she had purchased, and the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to were all about to disappear. "Additionally," I continued, "the legal team is prepared to provide evidence of your complicity in James's misappropriation of company funds, should you choose to pursue wrongful termination claims." I closed my folder and stood. "Security will escort you to your offices to collect your personal belongings. Your system access has already been revoked, and your company devices will be confiscated for forensic analysis." The room had gone completely silent again, the remaining board members seemingly holding their breath as they watched this corporate and personal drama unfold. Victoria's composed facade finally cracked. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice smaller now. "If what you're saying is true, then the house is mine," I confirmed, "as are both vehicles and virtually everything in your closet. However, I've arranged for a serviced apartment where you can stay for the next 30 days while you reassess your situation." I nodded to Lynn, who handed Victoria a sealed envelope containing the apartment details and a cashier's check. A more generous settlement than the prenuptial agreement required, though Victoria wouldn't realize that until later. "You bastard," she whispered, tears finally welling in her eyes. 5 years of my life, for what? So you could set me up for this fall? Was any of it real? For the first time since entering the boardroom, I allowed my professional veneer to slip slightly. "I loved you, Victoria. That was real. I kept hoping you would prove me wrong, that your character was stronger than your ambition. I waited for you to see value in me beyond my apparent career success." I shook my head. "I'm still waiting." Her tears spilled over now, mascara creating dark tracks down her perfectly made-up face. James took a half-step toward her but stopped when one of the security officers moved forward. "This meeting is adjourned," I announced to the shell-shocked board. "The remaining members will reconvene at 3 o'clock this afternoon to vote on the interim leadership and approve the restructuring plan. Ms. Lynn will coordinate the transition details." As I gathered my materials, Victoria made one final attempt. "Michael Alexander, whatever your name is, you can't just throw away 5 years of marriage like this." I paused, looking directly into her eyes. "You threw it away, Victoria. One condescending comment, one public humiliation, one betrayal at a time. I'm just making it official." I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Oh, and Victoria, about that cleaning position I mentioned. It wasn't entirely a joke. Greenpoint's janitorial service is actually a subsidiary of Nexus Holdings. If you find yourself in need of employment, they're always hiring. The manager owes me a favor." With that, I left the boardroom, the sounds of Victoria's angry sobs fading behind me as the door closed. In the adjacent conference room, the legal team waited with prepared separation agreements and non-disclosure contracts. The machine I had set in motion was running perfectly. But as I walked into the sunlight of a Seattle morning, I felt none of the satisfaction I had anticipated during all those years of planning. Only a hollow emptiness where 5 years of my life and one failed marriage used to be. The weeks following the boardroom revelation passed in a blur of meetings, legal proceedings, and corporate restructuring. Greenpoint Innovations underwent a dramatic transformation as I implemented the changes I'd been planning for years. The toxic leadership was removed, talented employees were promoted, and the company culture began a slow but steady shift towards something more sustainable. I moved out of our house the same day as the boardroom confrontation, relocating to my penthouse in downtown Seattle, a property Victoria had never known existed. The house we had shared stood empty, its modern walls and designer furnishings now just hollow reminders of a life built on deception. I couldn't bring myself to sell it yet, but I couldn't live there either. Lynn kept me updated on Victoria's situation, part of our standard protocol for high-level terminations, but also driven by my own complicated need to know she was all right despite everything. She had moved into the serviced apartment I had arranged, accepting the cashier's check, but refusing to sign the additional settlement agreement that would have provided her with a more substantial financial cushion. She's hired Patricia Winters as her attorney, Lynn informed me one afternoon, placing a folder on my desk. Apparently, Winters resigned from Greenpoint immediately after our takeover. Smart move, I acknowledged. Patricia had been one of the few executives whose ethics had remained relatively intact. What are they planning? They're challenging the prenuptial agreement, claiming it's invalidated by your use of a false identity during the marriage. I nodded, having anticipated this approach. And their chances? Lynn's expression remained neutral, but I could read the certainty in her eyes. Minimal to none. Your legal team drafted the prenup under your legal name, Alexander Chen, with all proper disclosures of assets. The fact that you used a different name socially doesn't invalidate the contract, especially given the documented infidelity. I sighed, leaning back in my chair and staring out at the Seattle skyline. Rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirroring the grey mood that had settled over me since the confrontation. "What about James?" I asked. "Terminated, blacklisted from most major firms in the region after the evidence of his financial misconduct was quietly circulated. He's apparently moved to Portland to work for a smaller agency." Lynn hesitated, then added, "He and Victoria are no longer in contact, according to our sources." That didn't surprise me. James had never struck me as someone who would stand by a partner once they no longer served his ambitions. Without Victoria's position and connections, she had become a liability rather than an asset to him. And Victoria's job search? Lynn consulted her tablet. "She's had 7 interviews in the past 2 weeks, no offers. Your name carries significant weight in this city, but we haven't actively interfered." She looked up, meeting my gaze directly. "Though your reputation alone seems to be having the same effect." I stood and walked to the window, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. Victoria had been a talented marketing executive, regardless of her personal failings. In another city, away from my sphere of influence, she would likely find success again. Part of me wanted that for her, despite everything. "Sir," Lynn said carefully, "the team is wondering about your plans for Greenpoint's executive leadership. The interim CEO has stabilized operations, but a permanent appointment is needed." "I know," I replied without turning. "I'm still considering options." The truth was, Greenpoint had been a means to an end, a way to expose Victoria's true character and the corrupt leadership that had enabled her rise. Now that those objectives were accomplished, my interest in the company had waned. It had potential, certainly, but lacked the innovative core that would make it truly valuable in my portfolio. "There's one more thing," Lynn said, her tone shifting slightly. "Victoria has applied for a position." That caught my attention. I turned from the window. "With Nexus?" "No, sir. With Greenpoint's Facilities Management Department." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "Facilities management? You mean—" "The janitorial service," Lynn confirmed, her expression unreadable. "She applied under her maiden name, Victoria Lang, but our HR screening flagged the application immediately." I sat down heavily in my chair, trying to process this unexpected development. "That's impossible. She's qualified for executive positions. Why would she—" "The application included a cover letter," Lynn interrupted, sliding a printed page across my desk. "She specifically requested that it be delivered to you personally." I picked up the letter, recognizing Victoria's handwriting immediately. "Alexander, or do you prefer Michael?" I won't pretend this letter is easy to write. My pride, the same pride you found so contemptible, made me delay it for weeks. But circumstances have forced my hand. You were right about many things. James abandoned me the moment I became a liability rather than an asset. My friends disappeared once my social standing evaporated. The corporate world that once celebrated me now treats me as toxic waste. Your reach, it seems, extends further than I imagined. You've taken everything from me, my career, my home, my reputation, my future. The settlement you offered would solve my immediate financial concerns, but accepting it means acknowledging my complete defeat. Perhaps that stubborn pride is all I have left. Which brings me to this application. Yes, I'm aware of the position's nature. Yes, I understand the humiliation it represents. Consider it my acknowledgement of the cosmic justice you've engineered so meticulously. For 5 years, I demeaned and belittled you, believing myself superior while unknowingly living off your success. Now I'm willing to clean toilets in the building you own, in the company you control, if that's what it takes to survive. Is this what you wanted? To see me brought so low that I would beg for scraps from your table? If so, congratulations. You've won completely. But know this. The woman you married, the one you claim to have loved once, is not entirely gone. I made terrible mistakes. I became someone I barely recognize. But beneath the ambition and arrogance that consumed me, there remains a person capable of learning from those mistakes. If this application amuses you, so be it. If you choose to reject it out of hand, I understand. But if there's even a fraction of the man I once loved still inside you, whether he's called Michael or Alexander, I ask only for the chance to rebuild some semblance of a life, even if it begins on my knees with a scrub brush in my hand. Victoria, I set the letter down, a complex tangle of emotions rising within me. The Victoria who wrote this was neither the supportive woman I'd first fallen in love with, nor the contemptuous executive who had mocked me for years. This was someone new, humbled certainly, but with a resilience I hadn't anticipated. "What do you want to do?" Lynn asked, after allowing me a moment to process. I tapped my fingers on the desk, considering the possibilities. Was this a genuine change of heart, or simply another calculated move from a woman whose career had been built on manipulating perceptions? And even if it was genuine, did it matter? Some wounds ran too deep for simple apologies to heal. "Arrange an interview," I said finally, "but not with the facilities department." Lynn raised an eyebrow. "Sir? Greenpoint's community outreach program is being revitalized as part of the restructuring. They'll need someone with marketing experience to rebuild relationships with local nonprofits and manage the corporate social responsibility initiatives." I met Lynn's questioning gaze steadily. "It's an entry-level position. The salary is modest but livable. The office is on the third floor. Far from the executive suite, but not the basement either. Lynn studied me for a moment. A middle ground? Something like that. And if she refuses, if she's expecting either complete forgiveness or total rejection? I looked back at the letter, at the familiar handwriting that had once signed birthday cards and anniversary notes. Then she's not the person I hoped she might still be. Lynn gathered her materials and stood to leave, then paused at the door. The board meeting tonight. Will you be attending in person or remotely? I glanced at my watch. The old Michael Warren would have been arriving home about now, preparing dinner while waiting for Victoria to return from her late meeting. In person, I decided. And Lynn, schedule the interview for Victoria personally. I want to conduct it myself. After she left, I turned back to the rain-streaked windows, watching as the grey afternoon light faded into evening. 5 years of deception and betrayal had led to this moment. Not the triumph I had imagined, but something more complex and uncertain. Tomorrow, I would sit across from the woman who had been my wife and decide if there was anything worth salvaging. From the wreckage of our relationship, not as husband and wife, that chapter was closed forever, but perhaps as two people who had inflicted terrible wounds on each other and might yet find a path to healing. I picked up Victoria's letter again, reading the final lines. Perhaps we had both been pretending all along, she to be someone successful enough to deserve respect, I to be someone ordinary enough to deserve love. Our performances had been different, but the insecurity behind them was the same. As night fell over Seattle, I found myself wondering which would prove more difficult, forgiving Victoria for what she had done, or forgiving myself for what I had become in response. The Greenpoint Innovations lobby had been redesigned since my takeover. The pretentious, abstract sculptures replaced with comfortable seating areas, the intimidating security desk transformed into a welcoming reception area. As I passed through at precisely 9:30 a.m., I noticed employees smiling and engaging with each other, a stark contrast to the tense competitive atmosphere that had pervaded the space before. I took the executive elevator to the third floor, where the community outreach department occupied a modest but pleasant space overlooking Puget Sound. Rebecca, the department director, and, ironically, the former assistant who had witnessed Victoria's mockery at our dinner party, greeted me with professional courtesy. "Mr. Chen, Victoria Lang arrived 10 minutes ago. She's waiting in the small conference room." Rebecca hesitated, then added, "She seems different." I nodded my thanks and paused outside the conference room door, taking a moment to compose myself. Through the glass panel, I could see Victoria sitting with her back to the door, her posture straight but not rigid. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the elaborate styles she had favored as a marketing executive. Even from behind, I could tell this was not the same Victoria who had strutted into the boardroom 3 weeks ago. I opened the door and stepped inside. Victoria turned, rising automatically as I entered. The change in her appearance was even more striking face to face. Gone was the designer wardrobe, replaced by a simple navy blue blazer over a white blouse, professional but modest. Her makeup was minimal, her jewelry limited to small pearl earrings. But the most notable difference was in her eyes. The sharp, calculating ambition had been replaced by something quieter, more cautious. "Victoria?" I said with a nod, gesturing for her to sit as I took the chair across from her. "Alexander," she replied, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her shoulders. "Thank you for seeing me personally. I wasn't expecting that." I placed her resume on the table between us, though I had already memorized every detail. "Your application was for the facilities department, but I've asked you here to discuss a different position. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to understand why you applied for janitorial work when your qualifications clearly exceed that role. Victoria's hands clasped tightly in her lap, the only visible sign of her discomfort. I think my letter explained that fairly clearly. Humour me, I said, leaning back slightly. I'd like to hear it directly. She took a deep breath, meeting my gaze with a directness that reminded me of the Victoria I had first met. Every marketing position I've applied for has rejected me. Some outright told me that my connection to the Greenpoint scandal, as their calling it, makes me untouchable. Others are more subtle, but the result is the same. She gave a small, humorless smile. It seems your influence extends further than I realized. I haven't blacklisted you, Victoria, I said quietly. Perhaps not actively, she acknowledged, but your reputation in this city means you don't have to. The whispers and rumors are doing that work for you. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her blazer, a nervous gesture I recognized from our early dating days. The janitorial position was, well, partly symbolic, I suppose. A recognition of how completely our positions have reversed. But also practical. I need work, Alexander, any work. I studied her for a long moment, searching for signs of the manipulation and calculation that had characterized her professional persona for so long. I found none, just exhaustion and a wary resilience. The position I want to discuss is with Greenpoint's community outreach program, I said finally. Entry-level, focused on rebuilding relationships with local nonprofits and managing some of our corporate social responsibility initiatives. The salary is modest, $65,000 annually, but it includes benefits. Victoria's expression registered surprise, then confusion. Why would you offer me that after everything? Because despite your other failings, you're an excellent marketer. Your skills shouldn't go to waste scrubbing floors. I slid a folder across the table. The position reports to Rebecca Torres, your former assistant, incidentally. You would have no direct reports of your own, no expense account, and a 6-month probationary period with weekly performance reviews. She opened the folder, scanning the job description with the quick efficiency I had once admired. This is not what I expected. What did you expect? Victoria closed the folder and looked up at me, her expression unguarded for the first time in years. Either complete rejection or some form of humiliating charity. This is neither. It's just a job, a fair opportunity. Yes, I agreed. That's exactly what it is. Why? She asked again, more insistently this time. You have every reason to hate me, to want to see me suffer. I certainly gave you enough ammunition over the years. I considered my answer carefully. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure myself. Perhaps some part of me still remembered the woman Victoria had been before success had warped her priorities. Or perhaps I simply couldn't bring myself to be as cruel as she had been. I don't hate you, Victoria, I said finally. I'm angry, yes, disappointed certainly, but hatred requires an ongoing investment of emotion that I'm not willing to make. She flinched slightly at that, as if my indifference hurt more than anger would have. Besides, I continued, watching you clean toilets wouldn't bring me any satisfaction. It would just be another kind of deception, pretending that reversing our positions would somehow balance the scales. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder. What about the settlement offer? She asked finally. Is that still on the table? It is, separate from this job opportunity. One doesn't depend on the other. She nodded slowly. And us? What happens to whatever is left between us? It was the question I had been dreading, the one that pierced through the business arrangements and legal documents to the heart of what had once been a marriage built on love, however misguided. There is no us, Victoria, not anymore. The words came out more gently than I had intended. Too much damage has been done on both sides. You destroyed my trust with your contempt and infidelity. I destroyed yours with 5 years of deception. So this job, it's not some convoluted path to reconciliation? No, I said firmly. It's exactly what it appears to be, a fair opportunity based on your actual qualifications. Nothing more, nothing less. Something like relief flickered across her face, followed by a sadness that seemed genuine. I don't know if I can work in that building, passing you in the hallways, pretending we're just employer and employee. I've relocated permanently to Nexus Holdings' main office, I told her. Greenpoint's daily operations are being handled by the new executive team. Our paths would rarely, if ever, cross. Victoria absorbed this information, then straightened, her shoulders slightly. And if I accept this position, what are your expectations? Beyond the job description, I mean. That you do the work with integrity, that you treat your colleagues, including Rebecca, with the respect they deserve, that you leave office politics and power games behind. I leaned forward slightly. In short, that you be the person I thought I married, not the person you became. Color rose in her cheeks, not the angry flush I had seen so often during our last years together, but something softer. I'm not sure I know how to be that person anymore. Then find out, I said simply. The position starts next Monday. If you want it, Rebecca will be your direct supervisor. The settlement offer expires at the end of the month, regardless of your decision about the job. I stood, signaling that our conversation was coming to an end. Victoria rose as well, holding the folder against her chest like a shield. Alexander, she said hesitantly, for what it's worth, I am sorry, not just for the consequences I'm facing now, but for who I became, for how I treated you. You didn't deserve that, even with the deception. I hadn't expected the apology, and for a moment I wasn't sure how to respond. 5 years of resentment couldn't be erased with a few words, no matter how sincere they might be. But perhaps they could be a starting point for something less toxic than what we had become. Thank you, I said finally. That matters. As I turned to leave, Victoria called after me. One more thing, the house, our house, what will happen to it? I paused at the door. I'm selling it. Too many memories, none of them entirely honest. She nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between us. Goodbye, Alexander. Goodbye, Victoria. As I walked away, I realized it was the first time either of us had spoken without calculation or hidden agenda in years. Whether that was enough to build something new, even just a cordial professional relationship, remained to be seen. But it was, at least, a truth we both could recognize. The deception was over. Now came the harder part, living authentically in the aftermath. Victoria arrived at Greenpoint Innovations at 7:45 a.m. on Monday, 15 minutes before her official start time. The third-floor office was quiet, with only a few early arrivals setting up for the day. She stood in the doorway of the Community Outreach Department, a plain cardboard box containing her few office supplies clutched against her chest. This wasn't how she had imagined returning to Greenpoint. In her darkest moments after the boardroom revelation, she had pictured herself never setting foot in this building again. In her most vindictive fantasies, she'd imagined storming back in triumphant after some dramatic legal victory. And in her most desperate hours, she had resigned herself to entering through the service entrance, pushing a cleaning cart. Instead, here she was, neither victorious nor completely defeated, carrying a stapler and a few framed certificates into an entry-level position several floors below her former executive suite. "Victoria, you're early," Rebecca approached with a smile that seemed only slightly forced. The younger woman had transformed in the weeks since Victoria had last seen her. Gone was the deferential assistant who had fetched coffee and absorbed casual humiliations. In her place stood a confident department director in a stylish but sensible outfit, her formerly hunched posture now straight and assured. "I wanted to get settled before the day started," Victoria replied, trying to match Rebecca's professional tone. "I hope that's all right. Of course, let me show you to your desk." Victoria followed Rebecca through the open-plan office to a modest workstation near the window. It was nothing like her former corner office with its designer furniture and cityscape views, but it was clean, functional, and offered a pleasant glimpse of Elliott Bay in the distance. "The team usually arrives around 8, Rebecca explained, handing Victoria a security badge with her photo, obviously taken from her old company ID. "We have a department meeting at 9 to go over the week's priorities. Your computer is set up with standard access, though you'll need to request specific permissions for any databases or platforms you need." Victoria nodded, placing her box on the desk. "Thank you, Rebecca." An awkward silence fell between them, the weight of their reversed positions impossible to ignore. Rebecca had witnessed Victoria's worst behavior over the years, had been the target of her impatience and condescension. Now she was Victoria's supervisor, with the power to shape her professional future. "I know this is unusual," Rebecca said finally, her voice lowered though no one was close enough to hear. "For both of us." Victoria met her gaze directly. "I imagine you have every reason to make this difficult for me. I wasn't kind to you when you worked for me." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "No, you weren't. But that's not how I intend to lead this department." She gestured around the office. "What we're building here is based on genuine community engagement and authentic relationships. There's no room for the kind of politics and power games that used to define Greenpoint's culture." Victoria felt a flush of shame at the gentle rebuke. "I understand, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of something better. Alexander, Mr. Chen, believes you have valuable skills to contribute," Rebecca continued. "I respect his judgment, but the trust you'll need to build with this team will have to be earned through your actions, not his endorsement." "That's fair," Victoria acknowledged. "More than fair." Rebecca nodded, seemingly satisfied with Victoria's response. "Well, I'll let you get settled. The team starts arriving soon. They know you're joining us today." She hesitated, then added, "They also know who you are, Victoria, or who you were. There's no point pretending otherwise." As Rebecca walked away, Victoria sank into her desk chair, taking a moment to absorb the reality of her new position. The Community Outreach Department was responsible for managing Greenpoint's relationships with local non-profits, coordinating volunteer opportunities for employees, and overseeing the company's charitable giving program. It was meaningful work, the kind she had once dismissed as feel-good PR fluff when she ran the marketing department. She turned on her computer and began setting up her workspace, arranging the few personal items she had brought. A framed certificate from her first marketing award, a small plant, a photo of her niece. Conspicuously absent were any images from her life with Alexander. Those remained in storage along with most of her possessions from their shared home. By 8:30, the office had filled with the rest of the team, 3 young professionals who regarded Victoria with poorly disguised curiosity as Rebecca made introductions. "This is Zach, our digital engagement specialist," Rebecca said, indicating. "A man about Victoria's age with an open, friendly face. Layla handles our non-profit partnerships, and Jason coordinates employee volunteer programs." Victoria shook hands with each of them, acutely aware of their cautious smiles and evaluating gazes. These people had likely heard stories about the infamous Victoria Warren, former CMO and wife of the company's owner. They'd probably speculated about her dramatic fall from grace, maybe even celebrated it if they'd been among those who suffered under the previous leadership. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you," she said simply, resisting the urge to oversell herself or make grand promises about her contributions. The old Victoria would have immediately tried to establish dominance or curry favor. The new Victoria, still emerging, still uncertain, recognized that neither approach would serve her now. The morning meeting was a revelation. Instead of the competitive posturing and subtle undermining that had characterized executive meetings, under the old regime, Rebecca facilitated a collaborative discussion where everyone's input seemed genuinely valued. Projects were assigned based on expertise rather than politics, and concerns were addressed directly instead of dismissed. Victoria mostly listened, taking notes and absorbing the dynamics of her new team. When Rebecca asked for her input on a potential partnership with a local education foundation, she offered her thoughts concisely, without the performative confidence that had once been her trademark. Their proposal has merit, but their reach seems limited to higher-income schools, she observed. If our goal is to address educational inequality, we might want to ask how they plan to expand their programs to underserved communities. The team looked at her with mild surprise, as if they had expected either arrogance or complete passivity. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. That's a good point, Victoria. Layla, can you follow up with them on that question before we proceed? As the meeting continued, Victoria felt something unexpected, a quiet sense of satisfaction at being part of a genuine discussion rather than a performance. For years, her work had been about perception management, about creating the impression of success regardless of underlying reality. This felt different, simpler, but somehow more substantial. By lunchtime, Victoria had been assigned her first projects, reviewing Greenpoint's charitable giving guidelines and developing a communication strategy for an upcoming community service. Modest responsibilities compared to her former position, but she approached them with the same attention to detail she had once reserved for million-dollar campaigns. As she worked through the afternoon, Victoria found her thoughts drifting occasionally to Alexander. Was he checking on her progress? Did he expect reports from Rebecca about her performance? Was this position truly the clean slate he had presented? Or was there some other agenda she hadn't yet discerned? The cynical part of her, the part shaped by years of corporate maneuvering, couldn't help searching for hidden motivations. But as the day progressed, another possibility emerged. Perhaps Alexander had meant exactly what he said. Perhaps this was simply a fair opportunity, nothing more and nothing less. At 5:30, as Victoria was preparing to leave, Rebecca stopped by her desk. "How was your first day?" Victoria considered the question carefully. Humbling, she admitted, but also refreshing. Rebecca smiled, a genuine expression this time. "Welcome to the team, Victoria. See you tomorrow." As Victoria walked through the lobby toward the bus stop, her BMW having been reclaimed along with most of her other possessions, she realized she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The crushing humiliation of her downfall remained, but alongside it had emerged the faintest glimmer of something new, the possibility of rebuilding not just her career, but herself. "The Westlake property acquisition is proceeding on schedule," Lynn reported, swiping through graphs on her tablet. "Environmental assessment came back clean, and the zoning variance was approved yesterday." I nodded absently, my attention drifting to the view beyond my office windows. From the 40th floor of Nexus Holdings' downtown headquarters, I could see all the way to Mount Rainier on clear days. Today, Seattle's characteristic drizzle obscured the mountain, wrapping the city in a soft gray haze. "Alexander?" Lynn's voice cut through my distraction. "Did you hear what I said about the development timeline?" "Sorry," I said, focusing back on the meeting. "Yes, proceed with the accelerated schedule. The market analysis suggests we should be breaking ground by August at the latest." Lynn studied my face for a moment, then set her tablet down. You've been distracted all week. Is this about Victoria? I almost denied it reflexively, then stopped. Myself. Lynn had been my right hand for years, one of the few people who knew about my double life. She deserved honesty. Partly, I admitted. Rebecca has been sending the weekly reports on her performance. And she's doing well. Better than expected, actually. I stood and walked to the window, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass. She's been thorough, responsive to feedback, and apparently working effectively with the team. Lynn joined me at the window. You sound surprised. I am, in a way. I expected competence. Victoria has always been talented. But I also expected resistance, pride, some attempt to assert her former status or manipulate the situation. And instead, I turned away from the window. Instead, she seems to be genuinely embracing the opportunity. Rebecca says she's been humble, collaborative, even apologetic about their past interactions. Lynn considered this information carefully before responding. People can change when their circumstances force them to confront themselves, or they can become better at hiding their true nature, I countered. True, Lynn acknowledged. So which? Do you think it is with Victoria? It was the question I'd been asking myself since reading Rebecca's first report 2 weeks ago. The Victoria I had known for the past several years would have viewed this position as either a temporary humiliation to be endured or an opportunity to rebuild influence through manipulation. But the reports described someone different. Someone more like the woman I had fallen in love with years ago. I don't know, I admitted, and I'm not sure why I care. Lynn gave me a knowing look, but mercifully changed the subject. The Greenpoint restructuring is nearly complete. The new leadership team has settled in, the toxic elements have been removed, and morale surveys show a 48% improvement in employee satisfaction. Good, I said, returning to my desk. What about the innovation pipeline? 3 new products in development that actually show promise, now that R&D has been properly funded. Lynn paused. The question remains, what do you want to do with Greenpoint long-term? It's not a natural fit with our other holdings. It was a fair question. I had acquired Greenpoint as part of my strategy to expose Victoria and her colleagues, not because it aligned with Nexus Holdings' core business model. Now that the immediate objectives had been accomplished, strategic considerations should dictate our next steps. We have options, I replied. We could sell once the restructuring is complete and value has been restored, or we could continue to hold it as a diversification play. The new management is competent, Lynn nodded. And the third option, the one you're not mentioning? I sighed. Lynn knew me too well. We could develop it as a standalone enterprise under the Nexus umbrella. Their environmental innovation work could complement our sustainable development initiatives, which would mean maintaining a connection to the company where Victoria now works, Lynn observed neutrally. I didn't respond immediately. The rational business decision would be to sell Greenpoint once its value had been optimized. The company had served its purpose in my personal vendetta, and continuing to hold it might allow sentiment to cloud judgment. But something held me back from that clean break, something I wasn't quite ready to examine. Let's table that decision. And for now, I said finally, at least until the restructuring is fully implemented. Lynn accepted this non-answer with professional grace, gathering her materials to leave. At the door, she paused. By the way, the house sale closes next week. The buyers accepted all terms, no contingencies. The house, the modern showplace where Victoria and I had lived our double lives, where she had hosted dinner parties to showcase her success while mocking my supposed mediocrity, where I had played the role of unambitious husband while secretly running a billion-dollar enterprise. Good, I said simply. After Lynn left, I found myself opening the secure folder containing Rebecca's reports on Victoria. Reading between the lines of the formal performance evaluation, I could see Victoria's struggle to adapt to her new circumstances. Her skills were evident, but so was her careful restraint, the conscious effort to avoid the behaviors that had defined her former position. While I had been living as Michael Warren, Victoria had been playing her own role, that of the brilliant, ruthless executive who had succeeded entirely through her own merits. Now she was learning, as I had, that personas eventually become prisons. I closed the file and turned to the window again. The rain had stopped, though clouds still hung low over the city. Somewhere out there, Victoria was likely heading home to her modest apartment, taking the bus instead of driving the luxury car she could no longer afford, cooking for herself instead of ordering from the high-end restaurants she had frequented as a CMO. Part of me, the part that remembered every cutting remark, every public humiliation, every betrayal, felt a grim satisfaction at this reversal. Justice had been served, the scales balanced, but another part, the part that remembered how it felt to love her, to believe in her, to see her potential, wondered about the cost of that justice. Not just to Victoria, but to me. The years spent living a lie, nurturing resentment, planning my elaborate revenge. What had that done to the person I might have been? What opportunities for genuine connection and growth had I sacrificed in service? Of my deception, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, dinner with a potential investor at 7 noon. I gathered my things and headed for the door, pushing these uncomfortable reflections aside. I had a business to run, deals to close, a corporate identity to maintain, but as I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I found myself wondering about Victoria's day, what challenges she had faced, what small victories she might have achieved, how it felt to rebuild from the ashes of her former life. The thought caught me off guard. After years of calculating how to expose her true nature and orchestrate her downfall, why should I care about her daily experiences now? The scripts I had prepared for our confrontation hadn't included this ambiguous aftermath, this lingering connection that defied easy categorization. Perhaps it was simply curiosity, the natural interest in seeing whether someone who had been humbled could truly change. Or perhaps it was something more complicated, a recognition that our broken relationship, built on mutual deception, had shaped us both in ways we were only beginning to understand. As I stepped into the waiting car, I made a decision. It was time to see for myself how Victoria was adapting to her new reality, not through Rebecca's reports or Lynn's updates, but directly. I had avoided Greenpoint's offices since Victoria started her new position, deliberately maintaining my distance. But now, after nearly a month, perhaps it was time for a surprise visit to the Community Outreach Department. "Change of plans," I told my driver. "Take me home. I need to prepare for a site visit tomorrow." Tomorrow I would see Victoria in her new element, not as her husband or her boss, but as an observer. And perhaps then I would finally understand whether what I felt was lingering resentment, fading attachment, or something else entirely, something without a name, born from the ashes of all our carefully constructed lies. I arrived at Greenpoint Innovations shortly after 11 the next morning, timing my visit to coincide with a scheduled meeting of the community outreach team. Rather than announcing myself at the front desk, I used my owner's access card to enter through the executive elevator and made my way to the 3rd floor. The Greenpoint offices had transformed noticeably in the past month. The sterile, competitive atmosphere had been replaced with something more collaborative. Workspaces were more open, communication more fluid. As I walked through the main corridor, I noticed employees engaged in animated discussions rather than huddled protectively over their work. Several nodded respectfully as I passed, but there was none of the fearful deference that had characterized the previous regime. The Community Outreach Department occupied a bright corner of the 3rd floor. Through the glass walls of their conference room, I could see the team gathered around a table, engaged in what appeared to be a lively discussion. Victoria sat with her back to the door, her posture attentive as she listened to a young man gesturing enthusiastically about something displayed on the large screen. I positioned myself in the small waiting area adjacent to the conference room, partially obscured by a decorative plant but with a clear view of the proceedings. No one inside had noticed my arrival, giving me the opportunity to observe without interference. Rebecca stood at the head of the table, facilitating the meeting, with a confidence that impressed me. Victoria sat midway down the table, not in a power position, but not relegated to the edges either. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, her outfit professional but modest compared to the designer wardrobe she had once flaunted. I couldn't hear their conversation clearly through the glass, but their body language told a compelling story. When Victoria spoke, leaning forward slightly to make a point, the others listened attentively. When someone disagreed with her, a young woman in a bright blue blouse, Victoria didn't bristle or attempt to dominate. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully, making notes on her tablet. It was so different from the executive Victoria I had known, the woman who had ruled marketing meetings with an iron grip, dismissing contrary opinions and demanding unwavering support. For her vision, this Victoria appeared to be a team member, not a commander. As I watched, Rebecca called for a vote on what appeared to be two competing proposals. Victoria's idea, whatever it was, lost to the young woman in blue. The old Victoria would have been furious, would have found some way to undermine the decision or punish the opposition. This Victoria simply smiled, offering what looked like congratulations to her colleague. The meeting concluded about 20 minutes after my arrival. As the team gathered their materials and filed out of the conference room, I stepped forward, making myself visible. Rebecca noticed me first, her professional smile shifting to surprise before settling into a welcoming expression. "Mr. Chen, we weren't expecting you today." She gestured for the team to stop. "Everyone, this is Alexander Chen, the CEO of Nexus Holdings and Green Point's owner." The team members straightened, offering respectful greetings. Victoria, who had been checking something on her tablet, looked up at the introduction. Our eyes met for the first time since our interview nearly a month ago. I watched a series of emotions flash across her face: surprise, caution, and something harder to identify. "I'm here for an informal site visit," I explained to the group. "Please don't let me interrupt your work. I'd like to observe how things are progressing with the community initiatives." Rebecca nodded. "We were just finishing our strategy meeting. For the upcoming Green Seattle partnership, I'd be happy to walk you through our plans." "Actually," I said, "I'd appreciate a departmental tour from Ms. Lang if she's available. I'd like to hear about the projects she's been working on." I saw Victoria tense slightly, though she maintained her composure. Rebecca looked between us, clearly aware of the underlying dynamics, but professional enough not to acknowledge them. "Of course," she agreed. "Victoria, can you show Mr. Chen our current projects and brief him on the Green Seattle initiative?" Victoria nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Certainly." As the rest of the team dispersed, Victoria and I were left standing in the conference room, the glass walls ensuring our conversation remained visible to curious onlookers. "This is unexpected," Victoria said quietly, gathering her materials. "I wanted to see firsthand how things were progressing," I replied. "Reports only tell part of the story." She met my gaze directly. "And what story are you looking for, Alexander? Confirmation that I'm properly humbled? Evidence that I'm plotting some kind of revenge? Or just the satisfaction of seeing me in this position?" The directness surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Victoria had always been forthright. It was one of the qualities that had attracted me to her initially, before ambition had warped her honesty into something sharper and more calculated. "None of those, actually," I said, matching her candor. "I'm genuinely interested in how you're adapting and in the work you're doing here." She studied my face, searching for signs of deception, an ironic reversal of our past dynamic. Whatever she saw must have partially satisfied her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "All right, let me show you what we've been working on." She led me through the department, explaining the various projects with professional thoroughness. The Green Seattle Initiative was a partnership with local environmental groups to revitalize urban green spaces, with Greenpoint providing both funding and employee volunteers. Victoria had been tasked with developing the communication strategy, ensuring consistent messaging across all platforms. As she walked me through her presentation materials, I noticed the subtle differences in her approach. The old Victoria would have emphasized the PR benefits, the brand visibility, the competitive advantage over other corporate programs. This Victoria focused on community impact, sustainable engagement, and measurable environmental outcomes. "The employee response has been stronger than we anticipated," she explained, showing me the volunteer sign-up statistics. "We've already filled all the slots for the first 3 events, with a waiting list forming for future opportunities." "That's impressive," I acknowledged. "What do you attribute the high engagement to?" She considered the question carefully. "Honestly, people want to feel their work matters beyond profit margins. The previous culture—" She hesitated, then continued more carefully. "The environment before didn't create much space for that kind of engagement. Now, there's a sense that contributing to these initiatives is genuinely valued by leadership." I nodded, noting her diplomatic phrasing, acknowledging the problematic past culture without explicitly criticizing the regime she had been part of. It was a careful balance of honesty and tact that impressed me despite myself. As we concluded the tour back at her modest workstation, I found myself genuinely impressed with the quality of her work and her apparent commitment to the role. Whether this represented a genuine evolution or simply a strategic adaptation remained unclear, but the results were undeniable. "Thank you for the overview," I said formally, aware of curious eyes watching our interaction. "The program seems well conceived and effectively implemented." Victoria nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Is there anything else you'd like to know about our department's work?" I hesitated, then asked the question that had been lingering in my mind. "Are you finding the work meaningful, Victoria? After your previous position, this must be a significant adjustment." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise at the personal nature of the question perhaps, or at the genuine interest behind it. For a moment, the careful professionalism slipped, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath the composed exterior. "Actually, yes," she said quietly. "More than I expected. Maybe more than I deserve." It was the kind of honest vulnerability I hadn't seen from her in years, not since the early days of our relationship, before success had hardened her. Before my deception had laid the groundwork for our mutual destruction. Before I could respond, Rebecca approached, breaking the moment. "Mr. Chen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the executive team is gathering for the quarterly review, if you'd like to join them." I nodded, grateful for the timely interruption. "Of course. Thank you for your time, Ms. Lang. Your work is impressive." Victoria's expression revealed nothing as she responded with perfect professionalism. "Thank you for your interest in our department's initiatives, Mr. Chen." As I walked away, I felt strangely unsettled. I had come to observe Victoria's adaptation to her new circumstances, perhaps expecting to find evidence of resentment or calculation beneath a veneer of compliance. Instead, I had glimpsed something far more disconcerting, the possibility that Victoria was genuinely changing, finding meaning in work she would once have considered beneath her, and if that were true, if the humbling experience of losing everything had actually led her toward authentic growth, What did that mean for my own narrative of justified revenge? What did it mean for the years I had spent plotting her downfall instead of confronting our problems honestly? These questions followed me like shadows as I made my way to the executive meeting, where I would once again don the mask of the confident, decisive CEO, a role that suddenly felt more like a performance than it had in years. Victoria remained at her desk long after the office had emptied that evening. The encounter with Alexander had left her unsettled, stirring up emotions she had been carefully compartmentalizing for weeks. She stared at her monitor, the green, Seattle presentation still open but forgotten, as her mind replayed their interaction. Why had he really come? The question had been circling in her thoughts all afternoon, disrupting her focus and triggering the anxious flutter in her stomach that had become familiar since her downfall. Was it simply a business check-in, as he claimed, a power move to remind her of her place, or something else entirely? The Alexander or Michael she had known for the past 5 years would have had an agenda, a calculated reason for every action. But the man who had stood in her department today, asking about her work with what seemed like genuine interest, felt like someone different, or perhaps someone familiar from long ago, before their mutual deceptions had corroded whatever real connection they once shared. Her phone buzzed with a text from Layla, her colleague in blue, who had won the strategy vote earlier. Great job. Standing your ground with the boss today. Power move. Drinks tomorrow to celebrate surviving the Chen inspection. Victoria smiled faintly at the misinterpretation. Her team thought she had been bravely professional in the face of intimidating scrutiny from the company's powerful owner. They had no idea of the complex history that really lay between them, the years of shared breakfasts and inside jokes and quiet betrayals. "Sure, thanks," she replied, grateful for the friendly overture. Building relationships with her colleagues, real, ones based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics, had been one of her priorities these past weeks. A small step toward becoming someone different from the ruthless executive she had been. As she finally shut down her computer and gathered her things, Victoria found herself wondering where Alexander was now. Back at his penthouse? Working late? At Nexus headquarters? Or perhaps at what had once been their home, though he had mentioned selling it during their interview. The thought of their house, with its carefully chosen art and custom furnishings, all selected to showcase her success while unknowingly funded by his, brought a fresh wave of complicated emotions, shame at her obliviousness, anger at his deception, grief for the relationship that might have been if either of them had been honest. The bus ride to her modest apartment gave her too much time to think. Once, she would have used her commute to make calls, review reports, plot her next career move. Now, without those distractions, she was left with only her thoughts for company, and they were unforgiving companions. Across the city, Alexander sat in his penthouse study, a glass of scotch untouched at his elbow, as he reviewed the quarterly financials from Greenpoint. The numbers were improving, evidence that the restructuring was working as intended, but his mind kept drifting from the spreadsheets to the image of Victoria explaining the Green Seattle initiative, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm he hadn't seen in years. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, closing the laptop. Lynn entered with a folder. "The final paperwork on the house sale," she said, placing it on his desk. "Everything's in order for the closing tomorrow." Alexander nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the folder without opening it. "Thank you." Lynn studied him for a moment, then asked directly, "How was your visit to Greenpoint today?" He should have known she would hear about it. Lynn's information network was impeccable. "Productive," he replied neutrally. "The new management structure is working well. Employee engagement metrics are showing significant improvement. And Victoria," Alexander took a slow breath, "she seems to be adapting to her position. Her work is good, creative, thoughtful, strategic. That's not what I'm asking, and you know it, Lynn said, her tone gentle but insistent. He met her gaze. She's different. Or perhaps she's returning to who she was before everything. Lynn took a seat across from him, an unusual breach of their typically formal dynamic. And how does that make you feel? Confused, he admitted after a long pause. I spent years planning for her downfall, expecting to feel vindicated when she finally understood who I really was, when she faced the consequences of her actions. And I did feel that, initially, but now, he gestured vaguely. Now you're wondering if there might have been another way. Lynn finished for him. He nodded slowly. What if I had revealed the truth years ago when I first noticed her changing? What if I had confronted her about her behavior directly, instead of playing this elaborate game? What kind of people might we both be now? You can't change the past, Alexander. No, he agreed, but I'm starting to question the story I told myself about it, about her, about us. Lynn considered this thoughtfully. What will you do now? It was the question he had been asking himself since leaving Greenpoint that afternoon. The machinery of his revenge had functioned perfectly. Victoria had been removed from her position, humbled by the revelation of his true identity, forced to rebuild from nothing. The script had played out as written, but what came after revenge wasn't something he had planned for. The strange emptiness where satisfaction should be, the unexpected sympathetic twinge when he saw her working diligently in a role so far beneath. Her former status, the curiosity about who she might become now that the masks were off. I don't know, he said finally. The original plan was to distance myself completely after she was settled in her new position, to consider that chapter when closed, and now he turned to look out at the Seattle skyline, lights glimmering against the night sky. Now I'm thinking about next chapters, hers, mine, whether they need to be entirely separate. Lynn stood, recognizing the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. The house closing is at 11 tomorrow. Do you want me to handle it, or will you attend? Alexander considered the question. The house had been the stage for their mutual deception. Her performed superiority, his feigned mediocrity. Walking away from it would be symbolic as well as practical. I'll go, he decided. Some endings should be witnessed personally. After Lynn left, Alexander opened the folder containing the sale documents. The new owners were a young technology executive and his wife, eager to start a family in the prestigious neighborhood. They knew nothing of the house's history, the complex web of lies that had been woven within its walls. As he signed the papers authorizing the transfer, Alexander wondered what Victoria would think when she learned the house was finally sold. Would she feel relief at the severing of another tie between them, sadness for the home she had believed was hers, or perhaps, like him, a complicated mixture of both? Tomorrow, after the closing, he would drive past the service department building where she now lived, not to contact her, just to see it, to better understand the reality of her new life, the one he had engineered so carefully through years of calculated deception. It was a strange impulse, this continued interest in her circumstances. By all rights, he should be moving on, focusing on Nexus Holdings' expansion, perhaps even dating again. Instead, he found himself repeatedly drawn back to thoughts of Victoria, not with the vindictive satisfaction he had anticipated, but with something more complex and undefined. As he prepared for bed that night, Alexander realized that while he had meticulously planned Victoria's downfall, he had given almost no thought to his own path forward once that goal was achieved. For years, his secret identity and revenge plot had provided structure and purpose. Now, with those scaffolds removed, he was left facing an unexpected question. Who was Alexander Chen without his elaborate deception? Without Victoria as his unwitting adversary, without the driving purpose of revenge. It was a question he had never thought to ask, and one he had no ready answer for, as sleep finally claimed him. The morning of the house closing dawned clear and bright, a rarity for Seattle in early spring. Alexander arrived at the property 20 minutes early, parking his Audi in the circular driveway and sitting for a moment, taking in the modern architecture and manicured landscaping. Through the windshield, he studied the house that had been his home for 5 years, though never truly his home, not in the ways that mattered. It had been a stage set, carefully designed for the performance of their marriage. Every room held memories of the roles they had played, rather than the people they had been. With a sigh, he stepped out of the car and walked up the stone path to the front door. His key still worked, though he hadn't used it since the day of the boardroom confrontation. The foyer echoed with his footsteps, the house empty now of furniture and decorations, stripped of Victoria's carefully curated artifacts of success. Professional cleaners had removed all traces of their life together, leaving behind pristine surfaces, ready for new owners to imprint their own stories. Alexander moved through the rooms slowly, allowing memories to surface and fade. The kitchen where Victoria had instructed him to prepare appetizers for her colleagues. The dining room where she had showcased her supposed generosity by allowing him to join her important dinners. The living room where she had mocked his career aspirations with casual cruelty. He paused at the doorway to what had been Victoria's home office, her sanctuary and command center. How many times had she closed that door to take important calls that he now knew had sometimes been with James? How many evenings had she spent there, crafting presentations and strategies while believing herself the primary breadwinner? Climbing the stairs, Alexander continued his silent farewell tour. The guest bedrooms that had rarely seen guests, the main suite where they had slept, side by side, each harboring secrets from the other. He stood in the center of that room, remembering how Victoria had gradually migrated to the far edge of the mattress over the years, creating a physical distance that mirrored their emotional separation. The sound of a car in the driveway pulled him from his thoughts. Through the window, he saw the real estate agent arriving, followed closely by another vehicle, presumably the buyer's. It was time to complete the transaction, to officially sever this final physical connection to his life with Victoria. As he descended the stairs, his phone buzzed with a message. He expected it to be Lynn, with some last-minute detail about the closing, but instead, Victoria's name appeared on the screen. He paused on the landing, surprised by the sudden communication after weeks of silence between them outside of work. "I heard the house is closing today. I hope the new owners will be happy there." Simple words, neutral in tone, yet they stirred something unexpected in him. How had she known about the closing? Perhaps from one of her remaining social connections, or maybe she had been tracking the listing online. Before he could decide whether to respond, a second message appeared. "There's a small box of my grandmother's jewelry in the hidden safe behind the bookshelf in the study. I forgot to retrieve it. If it's not too late, would you mind saving it for me?" Alexander frowned slightly. The safe, one of several hidden compartments he had installed throughout the house, contained nothing of Victoria's. He had emptied it personally when he moved out, transferring the contents to his secure storage facility. There had been no jewelry box. Curious, he changed direction and headed toward the study. The room had been his private space, though Victoria had occasionally used it when working from home. The bookshelf concealing the safe was built into the far wall, looking like an ordinary piece of furniture to anyone who didn't know its secret. Alexander pressed the hidden mechanism, and the shelf slid sideways to reveal the safe. As expected, it was empty, the documents and valuables long since removed. He was about to close it when something caught his eye. There, in the back corner of the safe, was a small envelope that hadn't been there when he emptied the contents. He reached for it, perplexed. The envelope was unsealed, containing a single handwritten note in Victoria's elegant script. Alexander. If you're reading this, you came to check the safe as I hoped you would. There's no jewelry box. That was simply a way to reach you privately. One last time. I wanted to say goodbye to the house properly, but I understand why I couldn't be at the closing. This place represented so much to both of us. My pride, your deception, our shared failure to see each other clearly. As I rebuild my life from the foundation you've allowed me to keep, I find myself thinking not about what I lost, but about what I might become without the masks and expectations that defined me for so long. I hope you find what you're looking for too, now that your long game has reached its conclusion. Perhaps someday we'll both understand what we were really seeking all along. Victoria. Alexander read the note twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket. The doorbell rang. The real estate agent, no doubt wondering about his delay. With a final glance around the study, he closed the safe and headed downstairs to complete the sale. Across town, Victoria sat at her modest desk in the community outreach department, focusing intently on the volunteer coordination spreadsheet for the Green Seattle initiative. The message she had sent Alexander weighed on her mind, causing her to check her phone periodically, despite knowing a response was unlikely. She hadn't planned to contact him about the house closing. The information had come through Patricia Winters, her attorney, who had received the standard legal notifications. But something about knowing this final tie was being severed had prompted an unexpected impulse, the need to mark the moment, to acknowledge its significance in some way. The note in the safe had been left weeks ago, during her one brief visit to collect essential personal items under the supervision of Alexander's security team. She had written it on impulse, hiding it in the one place she knew only he would look, uncertain whether he would ever find it or what it might mean if he did. "Victoria, do you have those volunteer projections?" Rebecca called from her office doorway, breaking into her thoughts. "Just finishing them now," Victoria replied, forcing her attention back to the task at hand. This was her life now. Practical, work with tangible impact, so different from the high-stakes posturing of her former position. To her continuing surprise, she found genuine satisfaction in it, perhaps more than she had in years of corporate climbing. Her phone remained silent as the morning progressed. No acknowledgement from Alexander, no indication that he had found her note or had any reaction to it. Perhaps he had already instructed the cleaners to check all hiding places. Perhaps the safe had been emptied long ago, or perhaps he had simply chosen not to engage. By lunchtime, Victoria had stopped checking for messages. She joined Layla and Jason from her team at a nearby cafe, listening to their good-natured debate about the best approach for the upcoming community garden project. Their acceptance of her as a colleague rather than a superior still felt novel, but increasingly comfortable. "Victoria, what do you think?" Jason asked, pulling her into their discussion. "Should we focus on one large showcase garden or support multiple smaller neighborhood projects?" She considered the question thoughtfully, applying her marketing experience to this very different context. Multiple smaller projects would engage more diverse communities and create more opportunities. For volunteer participation, the impact might seem less dramatic in any single location, but the cumulative effect would be greater. Layla nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I've been saying. We need breadth, not just depth." As the conversation continued, Victoria realized she wasn't thinking about Alexander or the house or her former life. For these brief moments, she was simply present, engaged with her colleagues, contributing her expertise to meaningful work, existing without the weight of pretense or performance. It was a small revelation, but a significant one. Life continued. Beyond the collapse of her carefully constructed identity, beyond the humiliation and loss, beyond even the lingering question of what Alexander might think or feel about her now, the house closing today marked an ending, certainly. But as she returned to the office with her team, laughing at Jason's terrible pun about garden plotting, Victoria felt the tentative shape of a beginning forming as well. One built on more authentic ground than she had stood on for years. 6 weeks had passed since the house closing. The Seattle spring had fully emerged, bringing longer days and occasional sunshine between the characteristic rain showers. For Alexander, these weeks had been consumed with Nexus Holdings' expansion into sustainable development, a new direction that had energized the company and commanded his full attention. At least, that was what he told himself. "The Portland acquisition is finalized," Lynn reported, sliding a folder across his desk, "and the architectural plans for the Belltown project have been approved. We're ahead of schedule on both fronts." Alexander nodded, scanning the documents with practiced efficiency. "Good. What about the Greenpoint quarterly review? Have you had a chance to analyze their numbers?" It was the third time he had asked about Greenpoint that week, a fact that hadn't escaped Lynn's notice, judging by the slight lift of her eyebrow. "The new management structure is proving effective," she replied. "Revenue is up 8% year over year, and the innovation pipeline has 3 promising products in development. Most notably, employee retention has improved by 22%, and the community outreach department." Lynn's expression remained neutral, though the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. "Exceeding expectations. The Green Seattle initiative has generated significant positive press, and corporate volunteer participation is at an all-time high. Rebecca Torres is proving to be an excellent director." Alexander nodded, waiting for the information he hadn't explicitly requested, but knew Lynn would provide. "Victoria Lang received her 3-month performance review last week," Lynn continued, not disappointing him. "She was rated exceptional in all categories. There's a recommendation for expanded responsibilities, including leading the new corporate partnership program with local schools." Alexander absorbed this information, unsure why it produced the peculiar mixture of pride and melancholy he felt. He had created the conditions for Victoria's fall, had methodically dismantled her life of privilege and status. Yet now, he found himself quietly pleased at evidence of her resilience and adaptation. "Do you want me to arrange another site visit?" Lynn asked, her tone deliberately casual. "No," Alexander said quickly. "Too quickly. There's no need. The reports are sufficient." Lynn gathered her materials, preparing to leave. At the door, she paused. "The settlement offer to Victoria expires this week. She still hasn't signed the acceptance papers." This was surprising. The additional settlement beyond what the prenuptial agreement required had been generous, enough to secure Victoria's financial stability while she rebuilt her career. Her refusal to accept it was puzzling. "Has she given a reason?" "No official explanation," Lynn replied. "Patricia Winters just indicated that her client is considering all options." After Lynn departed, Alexander found himself standing at the window of his office, looking out over the Seattle skyline. The house sale had closed successfully. The divorce was finalized. All legal ties between him and Victoria had been severed, yet she remained present in his thoughts in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had not responded to her message about the house closing, had not acknowledged finding her note in the safe. What would have been the point? Their story was concluded, the elaborate game played to its inevitable end. Anything more would simply be an unnecessary epilogue. So why did he keep checking the Greenpoint reports? Why did her continued success in her new role matter to him? With a sigh, Alexander returned to his desk and the pressing matters of Nexus Holdings' expansion. Whatever lingering connection he felt to Victoria was simply habit, he told himself. A natural residue from 5 years of shared life. It would fade with time, like all things. Across town, Victoria hurried through the light rain toward the elementary school where Greenpoint's new education partnership was launching. As the project lead, she had spent weeks coordinating with teachers, developing age-appropriate activities, and preparing Greenpoint volunteers. Today would be the first implementation, a science and technology workshop for 4th and 5th graders at Rainier View Elementary, a school in one of Seattle's underserved communities. "Victoria, over here!" Layla waved from the school entrance, surrounded by boxes of supplies and a small group of Greenpoint volunteers. Over the past months, she had become not just a colleague, but a friend. The first genuine friendship Victoria had formed in years. "Sorry I'm late," Victoria said, shaking raindrops from her jacket. "The bus was delayed." "No problem, we're still setting up," Layla replied, handing her a clipboard. "The principal wants to meet you before we start." As Victoria followed Layla into the school, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few months. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced with practical business casual. Her luxury car was now a bus pass. Her expensive lunch meetings had become brown bag lunches with her team. Yet despite these external diminishments, Victoria felt a growing sense of purpose that had been absent during her years of climbing the corporate ladder. The work she was doing now had tangible impact, not just on profit margins or market share, but on actual lives and communities. The morning passed in a blur of activity as Victoria and her team guided excited elementary schoolers through hands-on science experiments. By lunchtime, her carefully arranged schedule had dissolved into creative chaos, with children eagerly exploring the interactive displays the Greenpoint team had set up around the gym. "This is amazing," the principal said, watching a group of girls building a simple robot under Layla's guidance. "These kids don't get many opportunities like this. Budget cuts have eliminated most of our enrichment programs." Victoria nodded, making notes on her tablet. "We're planning to expand this to monthly visits, if that works for your schedule, and we'd like to establish a mentorship program for students interested in STEM fields." "That would be incredible," the principal replied. "How long is Greenpoint committing to this partnership?" "At least 2 years," Victoria said, "with review and potential expansion after that." As she spoke, Victoria realized something had shifted in her thinking. She was no longer viewing this project as a stepping stone to rebuild her career or as an assignment to prove herself. She genuinely cared about its success and sustainability, about its impact on these children and this community. When had that happened? When had the performance of caring transformed into actual investment? The question lingered as she helped clean up after the workshops, chatting easily with volunteers and teachers. One young girl approached her shyly as she was packing materials. "Ms. Lange, thank you for teaching us about circuits. I didn't know science could be so cool." Victoria smiled, kneeling to the girl's level. "You were a natural. Maybe you'll be an engineer someday." "Maybe," the girl agreed solemnly. "My mom says I'm good at fixing things that are broken." The simple exchange stayed with Victoria throughout the afternoon and during her bus ride home. Once, she would have seen such community engagement primarily as a reputation-building exercise, a way to enhance Greenpoint's brand while advancing her own career. Now she found herself thinking about that little girl and what opportunities might open for her through continued exposure to science and technology. Her phone buzzed as she was walking up the stairs to her apartment. A text from Patricia Winters, her attorney. "Settlement acceptance deadline is tomorrow. Need your final decision regarding Alexander's offer." Victoria paused on the landing, considering the message. The settlement would solve her financial challenges, providing a cushion that would make her new, modest life considerably more comfortable. Yet something had held her back from signing the acceptance papers. It wasn't pride, as she had initially thought. It was something more complex, a reluctance to take the easy path, to accept a solution that hadn't been earned. The money Alexander offered represented the final thread connecting them, the last remnant of their tangled history. Accepting it meant acknowledging once more that she had been living off his provision all along, first unknowingly, then deliberately. "I've decided not to accept the additional settlement," she typed back. The prenuptial terms were clear and fair. "Please inform Mr. Chen's legal team." As she sent the message, Victoria felt a surprising lightness. Whatever came next, whatever success or failure awaited her in this new chapter, would be entirely her own, built on authentic ground rather than the shifting sands of deception and pretense that had characterized her marriage. Inside her apartment, Victoria kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto the sofa, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. On her coffee table sat a small potted plant, a housewarming gift from her team, and a stack of books about non-profit management that she had been studying in her spare time. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself. It certainly wasn't the life she had flaunted to friends and colleagues during her years as Greenpoint's CMO, but as she looked around her small, simple space, Victoria realized with quiet certainty that it was becoming a life she could respect, perhaps even one she could love. A week after the Green Seattle launch, Victoria stayed late at the office, finalizing reports on the initiative's success. The community outreach department was empty, her colleagues having left hours earlier. Through the windows, she could see evening settling over the city, the distant Space Needle illuminated against the darkening sky. The soft ping of the elevator drew her attention. At this hour, it was likely the cleaning staff beginning their nightly rounds. She returned to her work, determined to complete the impact assessment before heading home. "You always did lose track of time when focused on a project." Victoria's head snapped up at the familiar voice. Alexander stood in the department doorway, still dressed in business attire, though his tie was loosened slightly. "Alexander," she said, surprise evident in her tone, "I didn't expect to see you here." He remained at the threshold, as if uncertain whether to enter her space. "I had a meeting with the executive team about the quarterly projections. Rebecca mentioned you were still working." Victoria saved her document and closed her laptop, suddenly aware of her rumpled blouse and the coffee mug that had been sitting empty beside her for hours. "The launch exceeded our participation targets. I'm just finishing the assessment reports." Alexander nodded, taking a tentative step into the room. "I was impressed with the event. The educational components particularly. That was your addition to the original concept, wasn't it?" "Yes," she confirmed, surprised he knew this detail. "How did you—" "Rebecca keeps me updated on major initiatives," he explained, though something in his expression suggested there might be more to it. The watershed model was particularly effective at engaging children. Victoria felt an unexpected warmth at his specific observation. He hadn't just attended, he had paid attention. "Thank you." It was a team effort. An awkward silence settled between them, the first time they had been alone together since the boardroom revelation months ago. So much remained unspoken, so many emotions unprocessed. "I heard you declined the settlement," Alexander said finally, moving to the window rather than closer to her desk. The physical distance seemed deliberate, creating space for this tentative conversation. Victoria stood, gathering her things. "I did. May I ask why?" She considered the question, wanting her answer to be honest rather than defensive or calculated. "I need to build whatever comes next on my own terms. Taking more than I'm legally entitled to would have been another kind of dependence." Alexander nodded slowly. "I understand that better than you might think. Because of your father's business? Victoria asked. When he looked at her in surprise, she added, You mentioned it once, years ago, how you built Nexus from nothing after. What happened to his company? You remembered that. I remember more than you might expect, she said quietly. Not all of our marriage was a performance, Alexander. At least, not on my side. He turned from the window to face her directly. I've been thinking about that lately, trying to separate what was real from what was fabricated. It's not always clear. Victoria nodded, feeling the weight of their shared history and mutual deception. No, it's not. Another silence, less uncomfortable than the first. Victoria gathered her courage for the question that had lingered since she'd seen him at the launch. Why did you come to the event last week, and why are you here now? Alexander's expression softened slightly. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Professional interest in the project, certainly, but also... He hesitated. I wanted to see you in your element, without the pretense or power dynamics that defined our last interactions. And what did you see? Victoria asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Someone I might like to know, he answered simply. Someone different from the wife I resented or the executive I exposed. Someone new. Victoria absorbed his words, feeling their significance. I'm still figuring out who that is. Myself, Alexander nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Perhaps that's something we have in common now. He glanced at his watch. It's late, and I've kept you from your work, but He paused, seemingly uncertain how to proceed. Yes, Victoria prompted. The educational foundation associated with the Green Seattle Project is having a fundraising dinner next month. As a major donor, I'll be attending. I believe your department will be presenting the results. Victoria nodded. Rebecca and I will be there. Perhaps we could continue this conversation then? He suggested, his tone careful, neutral. In a public setting, with no expectations, just a conversation between two people with a complicated history. Victoria felt a flicker of something unexpected, not hope exactly, but possibility. I think I'd like that. As Alexander turned to leave, Victoria called after him. Alexander? He paused at the doorway, looking back. I found your note in the safe, she said simply. His expression revealed surprise, then understanding. I never left a note. Their eyes held for a moment across the room, the realization settling between them. There had been no note from him, just as there had been no jewelry box from her. They had each reached out in their own way, creating pretexts for one final connection. With a slight nod of acknowledgement, Alexander left, the soft sound of the elevator eventually signaling his departure from the floor. Victoria gathered her things, a quiet smile playing at her lips as she switched off her desk lamp. Perhaps they had finally found something honest to build upon. Not reconciliation or forgiveness, not yet, but simple truth. It was, she thought as she headed toward the elevator, a foundation worth exploring. The Educational Foundation's fundraising dinner transformed the Seattle Art Museum's main hall into an elegant venue filled with the city's philanthropic elite. Victoria stood near the Green Seattle display, having just completed her presentation on the initiative's community impact. Attendees had responded enthusiastically, with several approaching her afterward to discuss potential partnerships. It was a different kind of success than she had known as CMO, quieter, more substantive, lacking the performative quality that had characterized her former achievements. As she sipped sparkling water and watched the crowd, Victoria realized she no longer felt the need to impress anyone or maintain a carefully crafted image. The liberation in that simplicity was profound. Excellent presentation, came Alexander's voice from behind her. You've always had a gift for storytelling. She turned to find him in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking every bit the powerful CEO, yet somehow more approachable than he had during their marriage. Perhaps it was the absence of deception between them that made the difference. "Thank you," she replied. "The results speak for themselves, really." The community response has been extraordinary, because the project has authentic value, he observed, something I think we both appreciate more now. Victoria nodded, understanding the layers in his statement. They had each spent years pursuing external validation and superficial success, constructing elaborate facades while neglecting what might have been genuine between them. "Would you like to step outside for a moment?" Alexander asked, gesturing toward the terrace. "It's a rare, clear night." On the terrace, the Seattle skyline sparkled against the dark water of Elliott Bay. They stood side by side at the railing, a comfortable silence between them. "I've been thinking about our conversation in your office," Alexander said finally. "About what was real and what wasn't in our relationship." Victoria turned to face him. And I think we never gave ourselves a chance to discover that. We were both playing roles from the beginning, me hiding my success, you performing. Ambition, we never simply were. "No," Victoria agreed softly, "we never were." "I'm not suggesting we could go back," Alexander clarified. "Too much has happened, but I find myself curious about who you're becoming now, without pretense." Victoria studied his face, seeing vulnerability there that had been absent during their marriage. "I'm curious about that too, about who we both might be when we're not performing, or deceiving, or seeking revenge." Alexander hesitated, then asked, "Would you be open to exploring that curiosity? Not as Alexander and Victoria who were married, but as two people who might get to know each other honestly for the first time." "You mean starting over?" "Not exactly," he said thoughtfully. "More like starting from where we are now, with all our history acknowledged but not defining us. No expectations, no agenda, just discovery." Victoria considered his suggestion. Once she might have analyzed it for strategic advantage or hidden motives. Now she simply asked herself what she wanted. "I think I'd like that," she said finally. "Coffee sometime, as colleagues first, perhaps." Alexander smiled, a genuine expression she had rarely seen during their marriage. "I'd like that too." As they returned to the gala, Victoria felt neither the triumph of revenge nor the shame of defeat that had dominated their final months together. Instead, there was a quiet optimism about possibilities neither of them had imagined when their elaborate deceptions had crumbled. Their story hadn't ended with her cleaning his office, as the revenge narrative might have dictated. Instead, it had evolved into something more complex and human, two people finding their authentic selves in the aftermath of mutual destruction, and perhaps, if they were fortunate, discovering a connection based not on performance or power, but on truth. It wasn't happily ever after. It was something more valuable, honestly, ever after. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.